Today I'm going to talk about Azure Functions and SharePoint. So there's several reasons why you might want to use Azure Functions with your SharePoint development. You can do things like you can do with Logic Apps or Power Automate, like you can do a timer. You can have a function run on a timer. We're going to look at integrating Azure Functions with SharePoint Framework code. So, one of the things that's not possible to do with SharePoint Framework directly is like call it to SQL Server, unless there's a web service layer on top of it. But you could do that within Azure Functions. If you have some really sort of heavy processing code that you want to offload out of your TypeScript, you can use Azure Functions for that. There's several reasons why you might consider using Azure Functions. If you're not familiar with Azure Functions, basically it's just the ability to build a web service without having to build like a full web API project. So we'll see exactly how you can use Azure Functions. So a little bit about myself. I'm a lead consultant with Pate Group. Pate is a consultancy out of Cincinnati, Ohio. So we do, Office, SharePoint, development, planning, migrations, basically, a full service consultancy. And I've been with them for, like 3 or 4 years now, maybe even longer than that. I'm a Microsoft MVP, been a Microsoft MVP since 2004. And I've been involved in the Toronto user group community since the 1990s. So it's been a while. All right, so I don't have any slides. I'm just going to do demos. So I'm going to build a couple Azure functions and show you how to call those Azure functions from SharePoint Framework applications. So we'll start out by going to the Azure portal. So it's just portal.azure.com. And because I've created lots of functions, the function app is at the top here. It's highlighted for me. But if you don't have that, you can just go to create a resource, and then under compute, you can find function app, or you can just search for function app. So I'll get and choose that. And you need a resource group, so I'll create a new resource group, and I'm going to call this TSPUG app only. So I'll create a new resource group called TSPUG app only, and I will name my function TSPUG app only. What kind of runtime do you want to use? So do you want to do .NET, Node, Python, Java? I'm going to use .NET Core 3.1. So I'll choose .NET. You can use 3.1 or 5. I haven't worked with 5 yet, but it is possible to work with .NET 5.
Rob, .NET 5 is the one that's going to be short-lived, right? And then .NET 6 will be the long-term supported model?
So yeah, so every even version is the LTS version. So 6 will be the next LTS version.
And when is 6 targeted for?
That I don't know.
Okay.
You just try to find out.
Oh, that's okay. I don't want to sidetrack you.
Okay. Just a quick question, Rob.
Sure.
If you set your runtime stack, version, and region, are you able to change any of these after, or do you have to start from the beginning?
You can definitely change the runtime stack and version. The region, I'm not 100% sure whether you can change that or not.
Okay, thanks.
You might have to migrate the resource between regions. Might not just be a click and change.
Oops, I didn't want to do that. Let's go back. So for hosting, first off, I need to create a storage account. So I just try to keep all my names the same so I can find stuff. Storage accounts, you have to do all lowercase. So TSPUG. What OS I'm going to host this on? I'm going to host this on Windows. And what plan type do you want? So there's basically 3 plan types. Consumption, which says serverless, which basically is when you call your Azure function, if it's not already been hosted in an app service Microsoft or Azure will spin up an app service to host it for you. And then that app service will sit around for a little bit. It will serve any, future incoming calls. But if it's been idle for an extended period of time, then it will just shut down. So you don't have a specific app service dedicated to the function app. It is given to you as needed. So this is the lowest cost. In fact, it's very, very small cost to use this service. The drawback is that occasionally, if you don't use your service, you won't have one that's already run up or already going, which means you have to do a cold start. So basically, the app service has to start up, and the application has to be compiled and ready, and there can be a slight delay on that first call. So the other options are an app service plan, where you actually create an app service to host your Azure Functions so that you can then not have to worry about the cold start. And then there's some even more premium kinds of features, like the ability to run functions longer than a few minutes and so on, that you can have with premium. I'm just going to use the serverless.
Quick question on the timeouts, Rob. I see when you run it in the logs, it'll say like available for 2 hours. I assume that's how long your function will stay active after the request. Is that what they're trying to tell us?
If you're doing serverless, I'm not sure what the exact timeout is.
It
2 hours
to come back in the
right.
logs when you're doing the testing.
Yeah, I mean, that's easy the docs will tell you what the exact timeout is. Yep. I don't know. I don't know it off the top of my head.
I know you're limited on the runtime for a function. That's documented.
Yes, exactly. The same thing. Yeah. So how long the app service lives, I think it's 2 minutes or 5 minutes. I can't remember exactly how long you have for the function to complete, or it'll fail. So these are meant to be very, very short-lived. And then I think the next thing is application insights. Yep. So we'll just go ahead and do that, and then we'll go ahead and create it. So this process will take like a couple minutes to run, where it's going to provision all of the stuff for the Azure function. So we're not going to sit there and wait for that to happen. We'll just move off and do something else. So I could create my Azure function code in Visual Studio, like the full version of Visual Studio or VS Code. I'm going to choose to do it in VS Code today, but if you prefer to use Visual Studio, you absolutely can do that. So I'll just open up VS Code here. And to create Azure Functions, if you want some tooling in VS Code, you can install an extension. So I've got this Azure Functions extension installed. That will provide the tooling I'm going to show you. So when you install that, there's an Azure option over here in the left panel. And you can go ahead and say, create a new Azure Function project. So I'll go ahead and do that. And what folder do I want it in? I want it in the current folder. What language do I want to use? So you can see the options here: C#, JavaScript, TypeScript, Python. I'm going to use C#. What .NET runtime do I want to use? 3 or 5? I'm going to use 3. And what template do you want to use for your first function? I'm just going to skip that. So I'm not going to create a function right now. I'm just going to create the project. So in that folder, you can see there's a CS_proj file, a couple JSON files. That's really it right now. And it enables Git source control automatically for you. So let's go ahead and add a function. So I want a function that would just go ahead and get lists out of a SharePoint site. I want something, super simple. So let's call it get lists. And yeah, this happened a couple of times where that didn't actually run. I don't think it actually created get lists. No. Let's try that again. So I want an HTTP trigger. So I want this to trigger on an HTTP request. And I want to call this get lists. And it's going to ask me for a namespace. So we'll say TSPUG dot, and then we'll just use the name of the project, which is TSPUG app only. Grab that and paste it in here. And what access rights? We're going to secure this with Azure AD, so I'll just have Azure Functions say it's anonymous. It won't actually be anonymous. It's just that Azure Functions won't put any kind of like, you won't have to put like a key in when you actually call the function. And it prototypes out this function for you, scaffolds out this function for you. All right, so at this point, my Azure Function app in Azure should have been provisioned. It is. So I'll go ahead and say here and just say go to resource. This will go to the Azure function. So one of the first things you're going to need to do is just say that this function can be called from wherever you want to call it. I want to call it from SharePoint. So I'll grab the URL to my SharePoint site and come down to cores and add in my SharePoint site URL and go ahead and save that. I'll need that later. So that's one thing. I mentioned how I'm going to secure this with Azure Active Directory. So the next thing I'll do is set that up. So by default, calls to this Azure function can be anonymous. We don't want that. So I'll choose authentication over here. And I'll say I want to add an identity provider. And I want to use Azure AD. So I'll choose Microsoft here. So it's going to create an Azure AD app registration. So you can see that says here, create new app registration with same name as the project. That's exactly what I want. If I had an existing app registration, I could pick it. Do I want this to be single tenant or multi-tenant? Also, do I want to support MSA accounts, personal accounts? So I'll just say single tenant. Only people from this tenant should be able to call this Azure function. I'm not going to get into all the details here just to save time. I'm just going to choose all the defaults and choose add. Okay. So this is going to create an Azure AD app registration that will secure access to that Azure function. Now, if you're going to call this from the SharePoint framework, one of the things you need to do, and it's not obvious that you need to do this, is go ahead and edit here. And it's going to have this issuer URL, which will not work if you're calling this from SharePoint framework. So you need to clear out this issuer URL. Otherwise, you'll get 401 errors when you try to call this from SharePoint framework. So I'll go ahead and do that right now. And then I'll come back and open up another tab with the Azure portal in it. And this time I want to go to the Azure AD app registration that just got created. So I'll choose Azure Active Directory and then app registrations. And just search here for Azure or TSPUG. And the app only one. All right, so here's my Azure app registration. And I'm going to provide information about how users can authenticate with this Azure AD app and the permissions that this Azure AD app is going to request. So when you're working with SharePoint client object model and you're doing app only calls, you need to secure with client ID and a certificate. Okay, so I'm going to go here and choose certificates and secrets. And I'm going to choose to upload a certificate. So I've created a sorry, I'm blocking on the term.
Self-signed.
Self-signed, thank you very much. Self-signed certificate here. The instructions to do that are in this blog post series. I'll put a link in the chat. I'm not going to go through the entire process, but you can see there's PowerShell to create the cert and then exporting both the public and private keys. It's all laid out here in this blog post. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload that cert to Azure. So it's certs and then Azure Function App Test and add. Now that's been added in. So I can now authenticate with Azure AD using the client ID and this certificate. So in this particular case, I want to make app-only calls to SharePoint. So this is a scenario where you would use app-only calls. Let's say, for example, you're doing something that doesn't have a current user, like an Azure function that's running on a timer. Or you have a user, but maybe that user doesn't have permissions to do the task that you want to do. Like, I want to create a new site collection. So then you can elevate permissions using this technique. So under permissions, I'm going to say add a permission.
Just side note, I'm a big fan of this, of saying, okay, if you want your applications to be secure and the users are supposed to go through what you've built, then this is a great way to lock it down, to say, okay, the user doesn't have the rights to this. They have to come through our controlled server-side code that's running in this Azure function. So I like where you're going.
So I could use the Microsoft.
I will add to Peter. Sorry, Rob.
No, go ahead.
I will add to Peter's comment. Number one concern from every client that talks about API integration. So take note on this stuff, because we get asked this every time as Microsoft.
And the other piece, I covered it a lot in my webinar yesterday on security, was that self-signed cert that Rob was referring to. You know, it's fine to be fairly casual with it in a development environment, but it does have the keys to the kingdom. So treat it appropriately. There's things like premium key vault and hardware security modules that can be used to secure those. I mean, that was the root of a lot of the SolarWinds hack, where they did SAML. They stole the master private key certificate, and then they could impersonate anything they wanted to from there.
Yeah. And I will talk about Key Vault a little bit in just a second.
Cool. Sorry, Rob, go ahead.
No worries. So I actually could do what I want to do through Microsoft Graph. But to simplify things, I'm going to just choose to work with SharePoint and the client object model. So I'll come into SharePoint, and in this case, I'm going to choose application permissions. So again, these are permissions that are requested for the app itself. And I'm just going sites.read.all. Okay, so I want to be able to read information from the SharePoint sites in the tenant. So I'll choose add permission. Just for simplicity here, I'm just going to, as a tenant admin, so I have tenant admin privilege in this tenant. Instead of going to the consent form, I'm just going to grant the consent right here. It just simplifies the process a little bit. Okay, so in a second, you'll see that this, after I click yes, you'll see that this has been granted. Okay, so now I have an Azure Function app created. I don't have any functions in it yet. Like if we go back here and go to functions, there are no functions yet. So we need to do that. But I have the Azure Function app that can host the functions, and I have the associated Azure app registration, which I've identified how users can authenticate with it and what permissions it's going to request. All right, so now we have our get list function, and I just need to click that. So what I want to do is replace the boilerplate code that was prototyped out for me, or scaffolded out for me, with some different code. So let me go to, first off, I'm going to need a new get package. Let me add that. So I'm going to use the PNP framework. Whoops, I can't copy too much stuff. Okay, so I could just use CSOM if I wanted to, client object model. But I'm going to use this library. So Microsoft now has 3 libraries, well, 2 that wrap CSOM and 1 that sort of gives you access to communicate with SharePoint using either the graph or CSOM, or maybe even REST API. I'm not sure exactly how the internals. So the original library was called PNP Sites Core, which sat on top of the .NET framework version of CSOM. And again, all it was, it's extension methods that sit on top of CSOM. It doesn't add any new capabilities. It just makes it easier to use that library. Then Microsoft created a .NET, .NET standard, basically version of the client object model So they created a new library called PnP Framework, which sits on top of that. So if you want to use .NET Core, or if you're programming with .NET Core, then you can use the .NET Core version of CSOM, or you can use PnP Framework. And then there's another library called PnP Core, which is sort of separate from these other two libraries, which provides access to like SharePoint and Office 365, primarily using Graph, but using other libraries where Graph doesn't have support for the functionality that they want. But it doesn't use the same calling pattern that the client object model does. So you have lots of different choices in terms of, and of course you can use the REST API. There's lots of different other, and the Microsoft Graph. There's lots of choices here, but I've chosen to go this way. All right, so let me just close that down and come over here and grab this code here. So I'm just going to copy and paste it in, and then I'll walk through what it does. So I'm basically replacing all of what that function does. Okay, so I just need to get some type names resolved here. So I use control dot. Let that spin up. There we go. So system.link. And I need to use system.collections.generic. And I think that's it. Okay. So this bit of code here basically just looks for a query string parameter called site URL. Right. So this function expects a site URL to get passed to it, and it's going to list the sites or the lists in that specific site. Okay. So if you don't give it a site URL, it's just going to throw an error saying it's a bad request, that you need to pass the site URL in the query string. Oh, it actually says here or in the request body. I didn't actually implement the request body. So it's really just the query string. All right, so that's what that bit of code does. Then this next bit of code is going to do the authentication. Okay, so it's basically from here, this auth manager up. So we need to provide some information for it to be able to do that. So what's the client ID? So the client ID is the unique identifier for the Azure app registration that's associated with our Azure function. So it's right here. So let's go ahead and copy that and paste it in. We need to know the name of the tenant. So the name of my tenant is Rob Windsor 2. So again, if I go to, you can see there's Rob Windsor 2. What's the name of the cert? So the cert is this guy right here. You need the PFX file. And what's the password for the cert? Super secure. Of course, you want a better password than that. And in a production app, you would not want to have that password stored in your code. Also, for simplicity's sake, we're going to put the cert. We're going to deploy the cert to our Azure function app. You do not want to do that in production either. But just, we only have a limited amount of time here. So,
but Rob, if you were running in an app service, you'd use the app service certificate management for that cert, wouldn't you?
Oh yeah, you'd use you would use Azure Key Vault or certificate management. There's lots of different places you can put it that's not in your app.
Yes. But
I don't want to, to do that. It's going to take some time.
There's only so much time. Yeah, got it.
Yeah, exactly. So for the authentication to happen, it basically needs to read the keys out of the cert. So I have this code here does that. Okay. So you can see that it's looking for an environment variable called home. And if it doesn't find it, it's going to read the cert out of e/search/cert name, which is this right here. This is my local machine. Okay. But if it does find the variable called home, then it's going to read it out of there. So in your Azure function, there are sets of There's lots of environment variables. You can create new environment variables. Shoot, where is this? Properties. And oh no, that's not what I wanted to do. I've gone to the wrong place. Let me go this way. I'll go to Advanced Tools and open that up. Because we'll need this in a second anyway. App settings, I believe. No. Come on. Oh, well, see home. There you go. That's the home right there. Also, I think I can go to, there's a command window here.
Yeah, you can browse through that.
Yeah, if I say set home, there you can see the value of home. So it's basically C/home. Okay. So it's going to read that, and it's going to read the cert file from there. That's when it's deployed. Okay, so I've copied the cert to the folder. Now I need to make sure that when I do a build, package everything up for deployment, that gets included. So there's just a command I need to run to be able to do that, which is this guy here. A setting in my CS proj file, I need to do that. So let's just go to our CS proj file and say that we want that PFX file to be copied out to the output directory when we publish. Okay, so yeah, I didn't actually need to do this site URL. Do I need that there? Okay, this isn't technically part of the authentication of this step. But the last thing is the authentication manager. So the library that I brought in, the P&P framework library, has this thing called an authentication manager, and it has a ton of overloads depending on how you want to authenticate with Azure. So in this case, I want to authenticate using the client ID and the certificate. Okay, so that I'm going to pass that in, and then I just need to say what the tenant is. So it's the tenant name.onmicrosoft.com. I believe that the parameter is probably called authority. No, it's called tenant ID. But that's used as part of the authentication mechanism. So internally, what it's going to do is go authenticate with Azure and get an access token so that I can then make calls to the client object model. It does that it does all of that sort of inside of this authentication manager. And then after that, it's really just client object model, right? So I'm going to go get a client context, and then I'm going to go find all of the lists that aren't hidden using the client object model and return that as a list of string from the Azure function. Okay, so that's all this does is just basically take the list of string and turn it into JSON so it can return that back from the Azure function. All right, so any questions on the Azure function code before we move on? Okay. So the next thing we need to do is get our Azure function code into the Azure function app in Azure. Again, there's several different ways to do that. I'm going to show you one of them. So I'm just going to basically publish out the app to a folder. So it's going to build it, and then it's going to copy all of the files that need to get deployed up to Azure into a folder. I'll just note that the tooling that you have here actually has a deploy function, but I just find it's quite slow, so I prefer to do it this way. But it's basically doing the same thing I'm doing, just it's all doing it automated for you. I just need one more line to show up before this is finished. There we go. So I'm just going to copy this folder path to the clipboard and then go open up File Explorer and open that path. So these are the files that need to get deployed out to my Azure function. I'm just going to copy them to a zip file. Publish. And I might have started that before everything's finished. Let me just do that one more time. By the way, the name of the file here is not significant. And then back in my down here in the advanced tooling, there is an option to do a zip push deploy. So I'll choose that, and then I can just drag and drop my zip file onto here, and that will publish out my function to Azure. So this takes like 30 seconds-ish to do that. Okay, so the deployment started. It's got most of the files copied, and it should say finished in just a second. There's my get list function. And in just a sec, it should say the deployment's finished. Okay, there we go. So back in here, if I go to functions, this is my Azure Function app. If I go to functions, where's functions? There we go. We should see now there's our get list function. Okay. And if you click on that, then we can see the URL to call the function. So I can go ahead and just open up a new tab here and call the function. Because I have secured this with Azure Active Directory, it went and made sure that I could authenticate because I have credentials that are already cached. It didn't present a dialog for me. But if I hadn't had credentials cached, then it would ask me to log in. And you can see that I didn't pass the site URL in the query string, so it just reported that error message. But if I do pass that, so site URL is equal to /sites/demo, then it will show me the lists in that site as JSON. So we know that our Azure function is working as expected. So that's all good. All right, so now we need to, well, we don't need to, but the next step we're going to do is to consume this with a SharePoint Framework web part. So I've already got the web part created. I'll just open that up in Visual Studio Code. I just ran through the Yeoman generator. I didn't do anything other than that. So this is just a plain vanilla, SharePoint Framework web part. I didn't use React. I just chose to use no JavaScript framework for simplicity's sake. But I haven't made any changes to it other than the fact that I created the project. All right. So what we need to do is tell SharePoint that we want to consume that Azure function. And we do that through changes to the packages, package solution JSON file. So what I'm going to do is add some configuration which says that I want to request permissions to call out to a web service. And this is the way you do that. So you add in a web API permission request, which is an array. It's an array of objects that have a resource and a scope. The scope I'm going to use here is user_impersonation. And the resource, I can put the client ID or I can put the name of the app registration. I'm just going to use the name here. Okay, whoops, I didn't need to add a line there. All right, so this is saying that this particular web part is requesting permissions to call out to the Azure functions that are secured through that Azure app registration. And the other thing I need to do is just go ahead and modify my web part. So just like I did before, I'll add all the code. Actually, I need to do an import first. So there's a couple of different types that TypeScript needs to be aware of. So AAD client, HTTP client, that's the client I'm going to use to call out to the service. And this is a type which represents the response coming back from the service. And that's in the @Microsoft/sp-http package. And then here's the code. So I'll just go ahead and replace the existing render method body with that code. All right, so the first thing I'll do is just display a loading indicator saying that I'm running an asynchronous function that may take a little bit to run. And then I want to use, off of the context for the web part, I want to use the AAD HTTP client factory object to get a client so I can make calls to that Azure AD app. So in there, I need the client ID of the app registration, which is this guy right here. So let's go ahead and paste that in. So I want to make a call to that Azure AD app. It's going to give me back a client which can call that app. And then I need to say, what's the URL to the Azure function that I want to run, right? So if we go back to our Azure function, it's this URL right here. And I want to append the site URL for the current site to that. So I'll just say here plus. And it's got the question mark there already. So site URL is equal to, and I've grabbed the web object off of the context here. So I'll say here web.serverRelative URL. So that'll add in the server relative URL to that web in the site URL query string parameter so that it knows what site to get the list from. Okay. So this actually makes the call out to the Azure function. And that's going to get back an HTTP client response. Okay. So at this point, I know the function call is complete, so I'll clear the loading indicator. And I need to check to see what the response was coming back from the service. So if this call fails, the asynchronous call, the promise, won't fail. What happens is that the response OK property is false, right? So in that case, then we can go get the text that's in the body of the response and write that out as an error. Okay, so if the call fails, that's how we're going to handle it. And obviously, we don't want to continue processing, so we'll just return once we've written out the error to the screen. Otherwise, we want to get the JSON, which is the array of list names in the body of the response. And we'll take that array and we'll format it as an unordered list in markup. And then we'll just go ahead and inject that into our web part. Okay. So we'll just create an unordered list. We'll loop through the items in the array. We'll create list items to go into that unordered list. And then we'll close the unordered list tag. And then here's where we'll add that into our web part body. All right, so that completes the coding of the web part. Now, because of the way this works, we just can't go ahead and gulp serve this and run this in the workbench. Because we've made this permission request, we need to deploy the web part out to the app catalog so that SharePoint can be aware of it, and the SharePoint administrator can then grant the request we've made here to call out to that web service. Okay, so over here, I'll do a gulp bundle -- ship, which is the first step in the two-step process to create the package, which will deploy out to the app catalog. And that'll complete in a second. And then I'll do a gulp. Oh, sorry. I just forgot to make one change here. Just got the wrong name here. That needs to be 12. Oh, sorry. That needs to be styles. TSPUG app only. There we go. So I'll do a save, and then we'll do the bundle again. Okay, that's done. And now we can do a package-solution. And this will actually create the package that we are going to deploy to the app catalog. So that goes into a folder here. So TSPUG app only, SharePoint solution. So that's the package that just got created right there. So we'll grab that and we will go add that to our app catalog. And I'm going to make this solution available to all sites. So you can see here it says, please go to the API management page to approve pending permission request. Well, it should say permission requests. So it's requesting permissions to consume the TSPUG app only Azure app. So when I deploy this, then in my SharePoint Admin Center, right? So now I'm acting as the SharePoint admin. Under Advanced, there's this page called API Access. And any API access request made by SharePoint Framework web part or an extension will then show up here. Okay, so there, as you can see, I've requested TSPUG app only user impersonation. So my administrator can say, okay, yeah, I want to approve that. So they can click on the app request and say approve here. Okay, and choose to approve. One thing that's important to note here is that when you do this, if you haven't created what's called an isolated web part, which is way beyond the scope of this particular talk, those permission, when you grant that permission, it's granted organization-wide, meaning that every other SharePoint Framework web part or extension that I create can then make calls to that Azure function. Okay, so you do need to be aware of that. That granting permissions this way, it's for all SharePoint Framework code, not just the web part or extension that I'm currently working on. Okay, so I've granted that. So now I should be able to go ahead and use this. So let's go over to a site and let's go to the pages library for the site and create a new page called TSPUG app only. Oops. So I'll create a new site page called TSPUG app only, and I'll just clean this up a little bit. And then I'll go add the web part. So TSPUG. There's my web part there. And well, it came back quicker than, so you couldn't actually see the loading, right? The fact that it was loading the stuff, but you can actually see the lists here, right? So what it did was the web part loaded, then it went out and called the Azure function. Well, first off, it called it to the app. The app said, yes, you're authenticated, so you can call the function. The function ran and it returned back the lists that are contained in this site. Okay, now a couple of these lists, private list 1, private list 2, I've secured so that only site collection administrators can actually see them. Right, so let me just grab this URL here and come over to a user that is not a site collection administrator. Just make sure I'm in the right place. Yep, and let's go here. And you can see that they can see private list 1 and private list 2, right? And that's because I'm using app-only permissions, meaning that the permissions of the current user are not taken into account when the request is made to SharePoint. Okay, so in this case, I'm using it in a way to elevate the permissions. Okay, and again, there's some cases where you want to do that, but there are cases where you might not want to do that. in the cases where you don't want that, you can use what's called delegated permissions, where the permissions of the app are taken into account, but so are the permissions of the user. Before I move on to that bit of the session, is any questions that I want to cover? Three, two, one.
We are still here, Rob.
That's one of the beauties of virtual sessions, right? You never know. It's like you could just be talking to nobody. All right, so
good talk so far.
Thank you very much. So let's just go to TSPUG delegated here and do CLS and do the same thing over here. Actually, the process for delegated is very similar to what we've already done. Now, I don't want to go and create a brand new Azure Function app. Let me just move stuff around here. So I don't need these guys right now. So just go to Portal. I've already created this Azure Function app. So if I go to Function app, I can find TSPUG delegated. There we go. Okay, so I've just created the function app. I haven't done anything with it other than just create it. Oh, sorry, that's not true. I created the app registration that goes with it. So if I go over here to portal.azure.com and now go to Azure Active. Yes.
Question, Rob. It's Denzel. So I'm just asking, is it possible to use the same app registration, give both permissions, delegated and application, and then actually call delegated reverse? Is it possible, or are you basically? Absolutely.
No, absolutely.
Okay, that's good. Yeah.
So in your project, you can request permissions to call more than one web service. Right. So you could have one web service that uses app-only permissions and another web service that uses delegated, or you could
for the same register.
You could have the same. Well, yeah, you could have the same app and it requests one app-only permission and it requests another delegated permission. Okay. Yeah, absolutely, you can do that as well. Yeah.
I don't know what it would do if it was the same endpoint you were doing delegated and app-only to, though. Like,
yeah,
SharePoint sites.
The way you secure it, yeah. So you're right. So it would have to be separate services. That makes, yeah, you're right.
Okay.
But another thing to think about with the delegated versus app is around auditing and version history. It changes the behavior there as well. I'm not sure if you'll touch on that, Rob.
No, I won't get quite that far. No.
So when you go through delegated, everything happens as that user, and all the audit history shows that user, and the version history is an app only. It's actually the service principal that's in the audit log, so it's sometimes hard to see who did what.
Yeah, gotcha. That's right. So, so what you can do even with app only, is you can find out who, like, you can actually get who the current user is, even though their permissions.
Yeah, you can still set it, and it'll work for version history, but it doesn't work for audit history, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Okay. So I've got Sorry. Any other questions? Okay, so with the function app, I've got the app registration. That's all I've done so far. So maybe I've set cores. Let me. So cores. Let me just see if I did that. I might have done that. So we'll go down to cores here. I did do that. Okay, so we've done cores. We've created the app registration. What did I do? TSPUG delegated. So what we wanted to now go ahead and create the project here for the function app. So I'll go ahead and do that. So again, just go here, create project. In that folder, I'm going to use C#. .NET 3, and just wait for that to complete, and then create the function. I'm just going to use the same function. Oh, HTTP trigger, still going to be called get lists, and it's TSPUG. And then the app name. This is delegated. So just grab that. And anonymous again. Okay, and then I'm going to grab almost the same code. So let me just grab the exact same code I used before. All right. Oh, sorry, I need to grab that NuGet package. Let me do that. So I'm going to grab almost the same code. Well, let's just start out with the same code I had before. And then let's modify it. So just this. Okay, and I need to do that. Okay, so we still want the site URL, so that doesn't change. Okay, so we still want the user to be able to pass in the site URL, and we're going to get lists from that specific site. So let me just get the proper using statements in here. But this bit is going to change. We're not going to authenticate in the exact same way. Okay, so in this case, we're going to authenticate using a client ID and a client secret. So I've got the client ID. I'll go ahead and create the client secret instead of using the certificate. I could use certificate if I wanted to, but I'm going to do a client secret here. So we'll call this one 1 year, and it will expire in, not surprisingly, 1 year. And I'll just grab the value of the client secret. And actually, I don't even need to do that. I can just put it right in the app. Oh, actually, I need to copy and paste some other code. So let me put it in Notepad. Okay. And then back in my Azure app, when I go for API permissions, I'm going to choose add a permission. Again, I'm going to use SharePoint. But this time I'm going to do delegated permissions. Okay, and I'm going to request the same permission, but this time it's delegated rather than app only. So you can see it's indicating it's delegated down here. And just like before, I'll go ahead and consent that request. Okay. So now, as I mentioned, this authentication bit, so sort of all of this code needs to change. So that's what I will change. So let me just grab this and replace it. Okay, so I need a client ID. So same process as before. Go to overview, grab the client ID. I need the client secret. That's in Notepad. I need the tenant name, same as last time. But this time I'm going to create this thing called the user assertion. Okay, so the way this works is it's called the on behalf of authentication flow. So when SharePoint calls out to Azure, it's going to include a token in the request headers. Okay. And that token can be used to identify who the calling user was. Okay. So I'm going to also, from that token, I'm going to grab the user assertion. Okay. And then I'm going to pass the client ID, the client secret, and the user assertion to Azure to say, give me another token, right? So not the token that SharePoint gave you. I want another token that uses that information that SharePoint passed to you so that I can then call the Azure function. Okay. So I want to call the Azure function on behalf of the user identified in the token I get from SharePoint. So that's what's happening here, right? So again, inside the authentication manager, it's going out to use probably MSAL. I haven't looked at the exact implementation, but I'm assuming it's using the MSAL library to go call to Azure to authenticate and do the token exchange, so that you can then create the client context that uses that access token that gets back to be able to make these calls on behalf of the current user.
Rob, quick question on
Yes.
this. If I was calling Graph, I'd have to do that same first set of steps, correct?
If you want to call Graph on behalf of the user, yes, it's the same set of steps.
It's just a different authentication call that you'd make to get to Graph.
Yeah, so in my permissions, when I requested the permissions in here, I just would have made requests to Graph permissions rather than SharePoint permissions. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, and then the code to actually get the list and to send that back as the result of the function is exactly the same. So really, the only code that changes is the code to authenticate with Azure AD. Okay. So I'll go ahead and save that off, and just like before, I'll go grab the command to publish. Oh no, I don't need to do that this time because we're not using a cert. So I need to go ahead and publish this. Okay, so while that's running, let's go over to our SharePoint framework code. So I've already created the SPFX web part project, exactly the same as I did previously. And the config is exactly the same as it is for app only. So I'm going to go to package solution, and I'm going to grab that same config that I had before and put it in the exact same place here. So, and in this case, it is TSPUG delegated rather than TSPUG app only. So again, it's the name of the app registration. Okay. And the code for the web part is the same as it was before. So I'm just going to go to my web part and grab that. I need to do that import. And then I need to grab the web part code, which is exactly the same. And just replace this code here. And this time I'll remember to fix this. Shoot. Control Z, I went too far. No, it's not going to come up. So I need to go to the manifest. No, this guy here. And just grab that. Okay, that's what I need. And up here, just like before, I need the client ID of the Azure app registration. So that's this one here. And I need the URL to the Azure function. So over here, our publish should have worked, finished. So let's just go ahead and grab the publish folder path. Open up File Explorer, just like we did before. Go there. Just zip up everything. Come back to our Azure app, go to Advanced Tools. And then once that opens up, go to the zip push deploy. And then drag and drop. Okay, so while that's going, I can just switch over here to functions. So this should finish in just a sec. There we go. So let's go ahead and refresh. And just go ahead and grab the function URL. So we'll paste it in here, and just like we did before, we'll add in site URL is equal to plus web.server relative URL. We'll go ahead and save that off. And now we can go ahead and bundle and ship this. So gulp bundle -- ship. So this should just take a few more seconds. And then now I want to do a gulp package solution -- ship. And just like before, we can now go to TSPUG delegated SharePoint solution, grab that path, come back over to our app catalog, upload that. Same message down here about API management. So I can go ahead and refresh the API access page. And we should see the pending request to TSPUG delegated. Go ahead and approve that. And now I can come back to my site pages library and create a new page called TSPUG delegated. Go ahead and delete that. Remove that image. Add a web part. TSPUG delegated. And publish that. Okay, so in this case, this user is site collection admin in that site collection, so they can see private list 1 and 2, right? But the other user is not a site collection admin. So if they go to that page, you can see that they don't see private list 1 and private list 2. Because the request for the list was made using their credentials. They don't have permissions to see those lists, so those were not returned by the client object model, and they're not returned back to the web part. Peter, we were finishing up around 8. Is that right? Is that standard?
That's typical, but we can go a little longer if need be.
Okay, cool. So that is.
Sorry to interrupt. I have to go, but I had a quick question on functions usage.
Okay.
So I see that you're using it as event driven. So something happens and then you're saying SharePoint do something. So how would you approach this problem? For example, your OneDrive is now getting bombarded with storage from meeting recordings, correct? Like that's the new thing. And you're looking at moving that video recording to another location. Would you consider creating an Azure function that could detect for events or video recordings in your OneDrive in a specific folder, and then take action with that and move those files to maybe a centralized locations. Would Azure Functions be a good use case there?
So the function needs to be notified that that something happened, right?
Yeah.
So actually, I think.
So then you're
Power
looking at a
Automate would probably
subscription.
be a
Yeah,
thought about
Power
doing that.
Automated
Power-
logic apps, but they don't
Yeah.
have to do the work, right? You don't have to do the work inside the flow or
they
inside
call
the
the
logic
function.
app.
Yeah.
They could call the
Mm.
function, yeah.
Although
So
there's a REST endpoint that'll move a file for you, so it could just call that function. Yeah.
yeah, I'm just saying that's that these are the scenarios you could use, right? But there are different triggers that you can use, and here, let me just see. Azure
If you could
function.
define a webhook in something, the Azure function could be the recipient of that webhook.
Yeah, because Peter, Rob, what I'm approaching is using Office subscription. So you could say, go give me a subscription for change of files or add, right? And then it notifies you like when an HTTP is received, right? And then you can take action. But I'm just trying to get away from using, Power Automate. I'm trying to see what you're doing here with functions, and then I'm trying to debate whether the logic apps or functions would be a good use. Yeah.
So this is not a good. I'm trying to just get a list of the different triggers. Azure Function HTTP. Oh, that's HTTP. So there's different sets of triggers. Like one trigger is an HTTP request. Another trigger is a timer. Another trigger is a message gets added to a message queue. So there's certain triggers, and as long as there is something that Azure Functions can listen to say, I now need to run, then yeah, you could do that. But like a file getting added into OneDrive, I don't believe there's a trigger that natively Azure Functions support that they could trigger on that. But you could absolutely have a logic app or a flow that has that trigger that can run and then immediately call off to the Azure function. Generally, what you would do is, instead of having the flow or the logic app directly call the function, is that you'd have the function listen on a queue, and then you would add a message to the queue from the from the flow or the logic app. That's the traditional mechanism that you would use.
You're trying to save on everybody paying extra money to Microsoft, Jason. So we're finding this.
I completely
use the logic
understand.
app then.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the logic app, it would cost you, but it would cost you like
IT admin. This is like centralized IT managing people's video recordings, right? So this is not an individual saying, I just want to be productive with flow.
The other thing you could do is you could have a function that runs on a timer and goes and looks for new videos that have been added and then processes them. So does it happen?
Consider that one.
Rob,
the risk is they want it right away. That's what they have. They have very small quotas, and so we have to be mindful. For 24 hours could be full.
Yeah, but the function could run every 15 minutes, right? Like Azure Functions.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
They're cheap.
Yeah, especially Azure Functions that are serverless. The cost, the compute cost for the function is tiny, right? So, that's a solution. You just have it run every 15 minutes. So it's not instantaneous, but the chances that a ton of files are going to be added within 15 minutes are pretty small, right?
I've been thinking about the exact same use case myself and kind of solutioning. So does an app-only permission exist for OneDrive? Can a service principal access everybody's OneDrive? Like it can access everybody's
OneDrive is a SharePoint site. It has lists and libraries in it.
Okay, so it will have rights to that then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Peter. Sorry, I have to go. This was really interesting. I think you made me redo all my Power Automate now in Functions. So, you guys.
Code
all
versus
right,
no
have
code.
a great evening.
So Peter, so you can use the graph or you can use CSOM. It's really, you're just working with SharePoint lists and libraries.
Okay. So that same app-only permission will give you access to the OneDrives. You could do the scan. I've literally been thinking about that same scenario now that all the recordings are going to OneDrive. We want to bring them into the appropriate team SharePoint site. Yeah.
So I mean, there's you can do it, on demand as each file has been added. again, you just need something to trigger the function. Or like you said, if there's a REST API you can do it, then you can do that right from your flow or from your logic app, right?
Right.
The only thing is from the flow, if it's a REST API, then you have the HTTP connector, which is premium, but you know,
hence the reason for logic app. Yeah.
yeah. So, well, it depends, right? So in the flow, if the flow is not triggered explicitly by a user, like if the flow runs on a timer and you use the HTTP connector, then the only users that need to have premium licensing are the authors.
Okay.
Right. It's only if the flow is explicitly triggered by a user, like say, for example, kicking off an approval, that the users have to be licensed as well.
Right.
When those premium features are used.
I
These
thought the
nuances
premium
get
was
crazy.
I thought the premium was required if anybody benefits from that process.
I think you might be right, Bill. Yeah.
That's
So
the matrix criteria.
Yeah.
I have done an extensive amount of research and I have emails to indicate to me that yeah, as long as a user isn't, so for example, if you have a flow that triggers on adding an item to a SharePoint list, a user adding an item to the SharePoint list is not considered directly triggering the flow. It's indirect, right? Because the flow is listening for it has a webhook. It's listening for a web service call to notify that something going to happen. So in that case, the only users that need to be, and this is again sort of a very side topic, but that need to be have premium licenses are the makers, right? So, but if you have like an item in a list view, right? You use JSON formatting to create a button that triggers a flow, or you go into a library and go to the flow menu and kick off a flow that way, then those users are directly triggering that flow. They need to be licensed.
So not to take you too far off topic, but you just tweaked me on something of interest here. So our Teams provisioning open source stuff that we've developed over the years, I've recently re-architected it so that the SPFX web part calls a logic app with an HTTP endpoint, and it uses token authentication, so it's all secure from that point of view. But I don't do it in Power Automate because now I'm using an HTTP endpoint, and that would take me into premium. But I do like the Power Automate approval process, especially the Teams integration they recently rolled out. So I was thinking, okay, well, what if the logic app gets the HTTP post, does what it needs to do, and writes into a SharePoint list, which is where we want that data to go, and then the approval workflow kicks off in Power Automate, and that's regular 365 licensing because it's just triggering off of an item showing up in a list and going through an approval. Is that kosher, or is that a matrix?
So what's triggering the flow that calls the web service? The
insertion of an item in a SharePoint list.
Yeah, well, then again, the only person, if the flow is the flow that uses the premium features, right? It's not just the HTTP connector, but if the flow that uses the premium feature is triggered by an event happening within SharePoint, then the authors need to have premium licenses, but the users don't.
Right. Now, so in this case, the flow is only doing non-premium features. Everything else is in a logic app.
But you still have to trigger that logic app, right?
So it's an HTTP trigger to the logic app. It's a SharePoint event that triggers the flow, and the flow doesn't do anything premium. And when it's done, it updates something in the SharePoint list that triggers the next step of the logic app to finish up stuff.
Okay, I guess I'm not quite envisioning what you're saying, but it sounds like it's good to me.
It's a bit of a Rube Goldberg machine, but
yeah. Well, Rob, I was just going to explain. I've done similar where you basically use a proxy flow to submit the request that triggers the premium requirements, not the actual user.
Yeah. I mean, so many people have done the same thing, right?
We're getting into nuances, yeah.
One of the problems that using flow occurs is if you have to have this on every person's OneDrive, you actually have to go and configure a flow against every person's OneDrive that's unique. You can't use a common, right?
I wish there was a common one.
Yeah, there's no sharing capability in flow. So you basically have, if you have 100 people, you got 100 flows that are being triggered. And that doesn't always work.
Yeah.
But getting back to the Azure, is there any other questions on the Azure?
The actual
functions?
talk, sorry, yes.
No worries. I just don't want to go way too long.
Well, I think it leads into the fact that if there were a way to create a trigger that called functions within SharePoint somehow, and I suspect that's more like an extension capability in SharePoint.
So what was Stenzel referring to? There was an Office something that sounded like a webhook type of feature that I wasn't familiar with.
I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to.
He said, can I set something up in Office something? I forget what he called it. I have to spin back in the recording and have that call the Azure function. It sounded like there was some sort of piece
Well, you
of
can go
Office that let you
register a webhook on
webhooks
a library.
Okay, so that's what he was referring to.
Probably, yeah. So the trigger would be the webhook out of the libraries that you have, which is the OneDrive.
So then you could have the Azure
you
function
could
be the
absolutely do
receiver
that,
of the
yes.
webhook.
Yeah, so you can register a webhook with either SharePoint or the Microsoft Graph, that when an item gets added to that library, right, and then you can have that basically the function that the web service that gets called when that webhook, like when that event happens, is the Azure function.
So is there
the only
a
drawback,
common OneDrive webhook, or would it be kind of like what Bill was saying with the flows, where you'd have to register that webhook in each person's OneDrive?
It would be each OneDrive.
But that would still be better than like 1,000 flows for 1,000 users.
Yes.
Yes and no, because the drawback, especially if you're using Graph, is that webhook registration only lasts for like 3 days. So you constantly have to monitor the registration and make sure that you renew it.
So you need like a nightly job that just set the webhooks for every OneDrive. But they could all point to one Azure function, so you got a single point receiving those webhooks.
Absolutely. You could parameterize it so that the Azure function can then, and as long as the permissions it needs have been granted to it, then absolutely you could get a single Azure function that does that.
I suspect the webhook would want to enter things into a queue, so you actually had a record of all those firings external to function.
Yeah, because the webhook has to respond back to it's a very, very short amount of time. Yeah. So that's generally the practice, is that instead of directly calling stuff, you put stuff in queues, because you can basically receive the call, you put an item in a queue, and you bail. So that'll happen really, really quick, right? So that's very common practice.
Okay, cool.
All right, well, that's everything I wanted to show you. I appreciate it. A few resources. I put one of them in chat already. So these are a little bit dated, but they talk about similar stuff. So there's a 3-part blog post series that I have. You can see it's from 2019. So the UIs you're going to see, and the process is described, but the UIs you're going to see are going to be different. Also, I have when I was streaming on Twitch, which I really want to get back into. I did 2 streams that covered a similar topic, but they show you how to use Visual Studio and .NET Framework rather than VS Code and .NET Core. So if that's the kind of programming you'd like to do, you can go ahead and watch these. I'll put the links to these also in the chat.
Perfect. Yeah. So we're planning on a new TSPUG site, and I want to grab resources like this and put them on the event, so it's easier for people to find stuff from this. We'll also have the recording from this up on our TSPUG YouTube channel. So I'll send a note out to, or I'll put a comment on the event in the meetup just to have those resources.
Cool. And I should put together a GitHub repo with this code, so I'll just send you the link to that once I have that, Peter.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Rob. That was a good talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Lewis, do we have a speaker slotted in for next month?
Jack.
Oh, that's right.
I think you got
yep.
email, right?
What was the name of the topic again? I know it had to do with not ARM templates, but whatever they're becoming in Azure now.
Let's see if I can find that email.
Azure Bicep, the next evolution of ARM templates.
Ooh.
There you go.
So Azure Bicep's the new domain-specific language that enables you to simplify your resource deployment process on Azure. So Jack's going to take us through how we get started, speed up your Azure infrastructure authoring process, and talk about how it compares to ARM templates and how you upgrade them to Bicep. Cool. Have you posted this up on the meetup yet, Lewis?
No, I have not.
Go ahead. put that up, and then people know what we've got on tap for, what is it, May 3rd Wednesday, May 19th.
19th? Yeah.
Cool. Well, with that, I want to thank Rob for giving us a great talk tonight, and everybody for attending, and we'll talk next month.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Rob.
Have a good night.
Thanks. Bye.